Hello, everybody. Oh, double noises. I wanted to actually play this to begin with.
With a desire to reform domestic policies that would instead end with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Perestroika, or restructuring, was Mikhail Gorbachev's goal when he led the USSR.
We need more enterprise, more democracy, more organization and discipline. Then we will be able to bring perestroika up to full speed and give new impetus to developing socialism.
He realized that the ongoing zero-sum competition with the West was taking its toll on the Soviet Union's economy. Gorbachev sought to introduce a series of political and market reforms to revitalize the government. As part of those efforts, he pulled Russian troops out of Afghanistan in 1988 and mended ties with China, becoming the first Soviet leader in 30 years to visit Beijing in 1989 for a 4-day Sino-Soviet summit.
You get the picture. Anyway, we're gonna hopefully have a shorter one today because we've got a lot to write about. It's one of those weeks where they say sometimes nothing happens in decades, and then decades happen in weeks. It feels very much like one of those. As usual, I am Izabella Kaminska, and I'm joined by Dario Garcia. Hello, Dario. How are you?
Hi, Izzy. Well, good. Dealing with this flurry of fascinating information coming in today. It really feels like we're in one of these crazy transition moments, like you're saying.
I really do think it's the case. Last time I felt like this, I would say it was around October 2022, when it felt very much like there was going to be carnage in the markets, and I went out of my way and I did a sort of like best practice for how to deal with the markets in a crazy week survival guide for my readers. And of course, it never happened. And I felt, oh man, this has taught me a lesson. I was wrong. I over egged it. I need to. Sometimes I have to not listen to that little voice inside. And that means by the time March came and Credit Suisse was falling, I was a little bit anxious about going out there. And, I actually second guessed myself and said, no, it's not going to, because I felt like October, I had misread the room. But actually it turned out I hadn't misread the room. It just all been delayed. But I feel very much like something very big is happening, and it's happening on multiple fronts, right? So you've got France, you've got the elections in France, you've got the elections in the UK, and of course now we've seen the sort of obvious thing happen in America, which is that Biden is now clearly out of the running, and there seems to be suddenly a total consensus on that.
Obviously there's a really big challenge to the way you analyze things, because if you're right, these things aren't necessarily going to be very public knowledge. So a lot of these things happen under the current, and you're basically using a looking glass to find it.
I feel like there is, and this sounds really ridiculous and kind of arrogant maybe, and I don't mean it that way, but I do feel like everyone operates, especially now in the world of hyper information overload and complexity, that we are all in our little silos, and so we only see one tiny little bit of what's going on, and that's why things that are abnormal sometimes start to feel normal, because we can't see how our little part of the puzzle fits in with the big picture. And there are a few, I'm a kind of big picture person, and I often, I hate to say like Cassandra, but I do have this kind of Cassandra thing. And sometimes I'm wrong. I'm not suggesting I'm always right, but I see things from many different perspectives. And sometimes a big jigsaw puzzle kind of drops in and you suddenly see a whole new part of the puzzle, right? And I feel like it's happened like that. And I've had I've kind of really understood what's going on in Europe suddenly. So let's start with that, because one of the things that I think has been missed by the markets as well is that we are actually in a state of restructuring. We just haven't said it. And restructuring is a bit of a dirty word because obviously when we look at other authoritarian systems, whenever they've had to reform, whether it's in China in the 70s, whether it's Gorbachev in the 80s, reforms always have to come with the admission that there's something wrong with the system, right? And that's a hard thing for the people in power to admit to, that actually we need reform. And, you know, we've been sort of, I want to say loosely, indoctrinated into the idea that our system is the best system. And to sort of go backwards and say, well, hang on a minute, it's not just about a change of government at the top. There's an actual structural issue, a total structural issue where we have to reassess how we manage the economy. I think that's where we are now. And I think we've been there for a while. And if you think of it in terms of if you think of it like how we would describe what happened in Russia in 1980s, the first sort of push for reform was MAGA. And MAGA was, you know, that is the ultimate. MAGA is a restructuring party. Make America Great Again. I mean, it's there on the on the, you know, on the lid. It says very clearly,
Drain the swamp, right?
Drain the swamp. We've got to do renewal. And you know, like ancient history is full of this stuff as well. I mean, Augustus you know, renewal program after the great Republican chaos, right? So it's a normal pattern in history. And so MAGA happened, but obviously the system wasn't ready. Like the establishment, I don't think, could face up to the reality of the fact that the people had now got to the point where, you know, Adam Curtis has always said, like they were given a big button to say, you know, fuck you, and they pressed it. And this came as a shock because the people in the system are so part of the system, they can't recognize that the system might be failing masses and masses of people. And so the resistance, I think, was, you know, to the admission of MAGA, that hurt the establishment. And I don't think they were ready to admit it. And obviously Biden, I think Bidenomics is the next stage of restructuring, right? It was like an admission, like we do, if we, you know, it's not the system that's wrong necessarily, it's just we haven't invested enough. And so Bidenomics was like, it started in COVID, you know, it started as Build Back Better, then it was the Great Reset, which became toxic, like that term became toxic, right? So they had to rebrand it. And but all those, like whether it's Build Back Better or whether it's Great Reset, that is still another word, another phrase for restructuring, right? And then we came up with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a lovely kind of like euphemistic term, which goes over the heads of most people. Like, why, you know, my husband always says, like, why did they name it after a terrorist group? It's like, you know, IRA, right? But in reality, like IRA, whatever we're calling it, that is also that's obvious restructuring. And the theory behind it was just that if we invest, we can invest our way out of the problem, and if we just throw enough money at the strategic, and we make a plan, we decide what deserves credit and what doesn't deserve credit, we can boost growth. And, you know, like it wasn't bad. I think, you know, America has defied a lot of the kind of growth problems of Europe. But I think we're getting again now to this point where, you know, if you read Albert Edwards or when the last bear capitulates is usually the moment of greatest risk. So who knows? I might be entirely wrong, but I feel like maybe this is the moment like America falters in terms economically. But even before that, we now have the obvious come face to face with us, which is that Biden is clearly. I mean, did you watch the? I haven't actually fully watched it.
I watched a few of the gaffes, but it was too painful and cringe for me to continue. But there's one really good segue into materializing exactly what you're talking about, which you sent me earlier, which was about this Draghi competitiveness report, which I haven't read, but which
it's not out yet.
Exactly to what you're saying.
And so I think this is a really important point that people probably haven't picked up on, because it's one of those things that's happening in Europe that is quite obscure. And like, who's Mario Draghi? If you're in America, you probably don't even know. And essentially, they've wheeled out Mario Draghi because they know there's a problem. Like, we've had a wave of populism hit Europe, and economically, it's just the pits. Europe is in stagnation, and Germany, its growth engine is now completely, it's collapsed. Now, when you speak to the German finance minister or whatever, they're like, well, we're restructuring. We have to go backwards to go forward. So they're already talking in the terms of restructuring. But when you think about it, like in terms of the grand vision of Europe, I might be wrong on this. I don't want to. This is a huge simplification, because obviously things have it has been an ongoing project, and there's constant tweaking of the system. But by and large, since the 70s, no one really rethought how Europe was shaped in terms of its specialization zones. And so you had a general kind of unwritten rule where, the UK, that its competitive advantage would be finance. France was given agriculture, and some other, strategic industries. Germany was obviously the industrial powerhouse. I guess Italy got textiles and fashion and luxury goods and culture and tourism. Spain, I mean, you probably know more about Spain, but so it became harder and harder to as the new member states came in, they weren't carved out specific industries. And I think with the new Eastern Bloc, Poland was obviously given a bit more industrial it's come in to support Germany a bit on industrial stuff. And then most of the other Eastern European states, it's tourism, it's sort of services, it's information services, it's tech, right? And call centers and things like that. So that was the shape of Europe, and that isn't working anymore, for not least because the UK has left, so they don't have, they've lost that specialization. It's expanded. Now there's Ukraine. That's going to challenge France in terms of agriculture. So that it needs to be remapped. And Draghi has, as a result, been kind of working on this report for months now, which is due out. It's supposed to be out in July. And we've had a few leaks about what it might include or what, but really it's a restructuring project. It's a reform. It's, he's going to come out and he's already leaked, that he's going to, it's funny because it's called the competitiveness report, because that's how they see it. They see it as how can Europe succeed when the old paradigm, the old kind of rules-based order has been torn up, because the US sort of free market capitalism hasn't really prevailed. China, we can't compete with China without becoming more like China. That means more of a planned economy. And this is really coming to head with the EVs, so EV competition. Mm-hmm. We can't compete with China because they have subsidization to such a degree that, if they've decided they're going to excel, they're putting all the national effort into excelling in EVs. That's, to ruin everybody else and grab that market share. We can't do that in a sort of free market competitive system, right? So
and is that I think that was one of the really interesting things that you were saying, that because we can't compete by opening ourselves up to free markets, to this Chinese competition, that it was one of the reasons why the governments would essentially, or the EU, would be taking a much stronger hand in asset allocation. Could you explain that part of it?
Yeah, so essentially it's about figuring out what are our priority industries, which ones are we going to, we have only so much credit, right? And we can either there are only two options with over indebtedness and stagnation. One is to do a trust thing when you run the economy hot. And this has happened many times. China's done this in the past many times. And you hope running, the money printing effectively, it's like a shock therapy, and it projects you into growth because it forces you into productivity. This is kind of what Milei is now doing in Argentina, where he's removed the entire welfare net and is forcing people into austerity. It's not austerity because, well, it is austerity because he's removing like government, welfare, and that is shock therapy of like the highest IMF original concept of IMF order, right, or recommendations. But it's very chaotic and it's very upsetting, and it's likely to lead to chaos and civil unrest because suddenly people who have been dependent on welfare don't have welfare anymore. And it's cruel. A lot of people think it's cruel. So the alternative to that, you can also run the economy hard, but you repress the market, right? So you essentially come in and the government says where the remaining credit can be channeled, but on the assumption that the technocrats or engineers know how to galvanize growth better than anybody else. So they decide like, well, the industries that get credit, their AI, their defense, their green transition, if we just put everything we've got on like red, like a roulette table, right? And they're hoping that red is the right color. But of course, that's not a free market system. So you've got to be very trusting that your leaders know what they're saying. And this is kind of what Biden has done. They've run it hot, and the Fed is supporting them. It's very trust-like, except that instead Trust wanted more of a market role, whereas I think Biden is much more New Deal-y. And that's where Europe now has to decide, like, its added problem is that it has to have total centralization, because at the moment, because of the fiscal independence of different countries, they can all undercut each other domestically, and so they have no chance unless they streamline their entire fiscal position and become more centralized. That's why this is now a battle over Europe. This is why Macron in April said to the Sorbonne, like, if we don't get our act together, if we don't integrate, Europe will die. That's basically what he's saying. Europe could die if we don't get our shit together, because there's no room for any independent state to run it. Like what we're seeing in France is Bardella Le Pen party, wanting to spend their way out of, all sorts of trust-like, everyone's saying it's like trust. Slightly different because it's not free markety. They want to make industrial policy for France, and then the left wants to spend even more. So they like, the right wants to spend 100 billion or so, and then the left wants like 250 billion. And of course, markets are freaking out because they don't like that. And largely, I think the idea is it's not that markets in Europe, it might be that they can tolerate running the economy hot, but they can't tolerate it on a unilateral basis. So if everybody aligns together, they come together, and then as a single block, they decide to run it hot, markets might be a bit more forgiving, but not on an individual level. It has to be entrusted to the grand vision, which is where Mario Draghi comes in, because Draghi is now determining how that plan, that 5-year plan, I don't know if it'll be 5 years, but he's determining how it will be framed, and which, where specialization will be, and how best Europe can compete in a world where essentially there's all bets are off. We're all in a race to the bottom now. It's all rather like an arms race, because there is no longer a WTO sort of let's agree all the level playing field rules and we all pretend like it's a free market. We're all not, there's no level playing field anymore, right? And that is the war going on right now economically. And Draghi, I think he is supposed to be a force that brings everybody together. And then the question remains, how much free market, how much of a free market mechanism will there be? But ultimately, the big thing that they're going to come up with is this taxonomy of where, what will get, like the private sector debt, like what will be allowed and what won't be. And this is where the ECB comes in, because the ECB, if it extends its mandate to green, which is a big talking point at the ECB, I mean, technically it doesn't have that mandate, but if it does, then it will determine which industries along with the EU, get credit and which ones don't. So if you're on the naughty list, if you're not on the approved list, you don't get credit. And that's credit rationing.
This really reminds me of, if it really feels like what you're saying, like we're in a really pivotal moment where Europe may be able to step up and somehow take part in growing again and fixing some kind of the productivity, critical productivity issues it has. So I don't know much about this topic, as you know, you're really the finance person here, but it really reminds me of when the Industrial Revolution was happening in Europe, and how countries in the periphery reacted to these changes. And so we have, there were two extremes, in that Spain had an extraordinarily controlled economy, really controlled its imports and its exports, and engaged in highly protectionist measures, whereas Turkey did practically the opposite thing and had these agreements with these minorities, Greeks and Armenians and Jewish people, and they were allowed to import foreign capital, foreign goods at very low tax levies, and how that essentially had destructive effects on both economies. The Ottoman Empire, in particular, like regions of Anatolia and Syria and Lebanon that were as wealthy as Western Europe, in a matter of 70 years, had completely collapsed. And how interesting it is that Egypt, under Muhammad Ali, which is the same name, I always found it funny that it's the same name as a boxer, but from 1819 effectively ran an independent policy from the Ottoman Empire. And it really seemed like it was industrializing. It had this mix of, allowing certain imports in, protecting certain industries, investing in certain areas. But it all fell apart when Muhammad Ali died in 1849, if I'm getting the dates correctly. So I guess these are some of the historical examples that are on the table for the European Union. And the truth is, again, and I'm obviously not an expert on this topic, but the most critical way I can see this not happening is if the EU decides to take all of these measures and deciding the specialists and the losers and the winners. How can this really be done with national government still in the mix?
Well, this is the thing. So, what shape will the future EU take? And this is what's going to be determined over the next few weeks. I don't want to present myself as an EU expert. I have always avoided understanding Europe because it just made me want to cry. I've been forced to learn it very quickly through my job. I'm not on any, I'm not on the same level as other people, but I do get the impression as an outsider who's come in and looked at it, Europe is very different to the Anglo-Saxon system, right? The dirigisme has been quite normal. I mean, we even in the UK had a very controlled economy up until the 1970s. So for all our capitalistic sort of rhetoric, we did constrain, because we were coming out of the war, and we had lost an empire, and times are hard, and we had to allocate credit that was available, the last remaining credit that's available, to where the national interest lied, and that was things like the National Health Service got developed out of that. And so I can understand why a lot of people think that because we did it after the war, we could do it again now,
and it seemed to have worked before, right? So
it seems to have worked.
Mm.
And then obviously Thatcher then came along and opened, totally broke down the barriers, and we had unconstrained free market allocation of capital. But the difference between then and now is that coming out of the war, people just had this amazing, they had just gone through this horrific thing where they'd all had mutual self-sacrifice. They were used to kind of the repression of war, rationing, and fighting for a cause and having something in common, right? They had a cohesiveness that is not around today. We are so atomized. We have no, patriotism is a dirty word in many areas, right? And it's very hard, in my mind, to see that sort of economic policy working without a cohesive capacity to self-sacrifice, which I don't think, in the century of the self, I don't think anyone has that.
Mm.
And also a lack of, like, capitalism has also worked best when its excesses have been moderated by other voluntary mechanisms like faith, and Christianity or whatever. There's that famous, I think Edward Burke says, capitalism needs to be kept. I've messed up the quote, but capitalism without like morality is doesn't work.
Doesn't that
so that's very different. That's
Yeah.
why I'm not convinced. And the problem is, like, if you put all your eggs in one basket and create this sort of command economy, you've got to be bloody sure it's the right basket. Because if you just invest, and then productivity is not going up, then there's something seriously wrong with your thinking about how the economy works. And this happened in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, they just didn't. They were looking at the numbers and they were like, why is there no productivity? We just don't understand why the plan is not working anymore. And of course, the plan had run away with itself because it was corrupt. Corruption was everywhere, and it becomes so normalized that nobody could recognize it. Nobody could see that the plan itself was the problem. And that's, I think, where we are now. And I think it's interesting that we're having a reform party in the US. We're having a sort of backdoor reform in Europe without really, no one's really been, obviously because it's Europe, it's technocratic and coming without any vote, not an obvious vote, like the votes on a national level. And then in Britain, it's also on the table because Nigel Farage is actually there wiping out the Tories with a party called Reform, right? So, and Labour itself is coming in with the more dirigist alternative. So this goes to my point of everyone's lying about the economy, because the truth is there is no costless way to grow ourselves out of the problem at the moment. We've torpedoed those options, which means, and it was really interesting this week because the Institute for Fiscal Studies basically called everybody out in the UK, and they said, you're basically all lying. You're pretending that you're not going to raise taxes. You're pretending that you have like capacity to spend money that doesn't exist, right? Just come up and be upfront about the reality. And the reality is you're going to have austerity, or you're going to have financial repression, or you're going to have to run the economy hot. Those are the only options on the table. And they all include there's going to be a lot of people who can't afford stuff as a result. And so the cushy welfare state is going to have to be constrained in some way. And then the question is, like, is it about investment? Is it about more investment? Like, I don't know. I don't have the answers.
I have even less answers. But there is one thing that
viewers. Maybe we have some viewers today. We've got 5 viewers.
Wow.
That's very exciting. They've probably got us on mute.
There is one solution that pops to mind, and that's something that you've also been speaking of, and that you've been speaking of for a long time, which is the war economy. Because naturally, if there is a war, a real war, not like the little wars we have going on now, it would solve the unity question, at least on paper. And it would give some sort of raison d'etre for European unity.
I mean, I certainly see that logic. I certainly see, like, sometimes a good war is what you need to distract people from the failing economy. And of course, this is what the Soviets did as well. Like, they just piled in, spent more and more on the military system, created more. This pattern has happened before. But you've got to be damn sure that you know what you're fighting for. And I don't think at the moment we do. And this brings me to the second point, which is it's about now in the system where you can no longer lie to the people. You have to be upfront about these things. And so I feel like there's a moment where, and this happened in the Soviet Union. Like, Gorbachev realized that perestroika will not work unless the system comes clean about its own failings, because people who don't trust the system are never gonna be able to overcome these stagnation issues. And so Glasnost was about openness and the very important admission of like former Stalinist horrors, right? Which they had denied for many years, and they gaslit the population. And, you know, back then, not everyone, it was very similar to you know, for me, it's very similar to now. Like half of the population, like they believed what they were told. They were good communists. They believed ideologically in the concept, and they were not. It was hard to be suspicious because you would be sent to a gulag or disappeared, but also they weren't prepared to admit that the system had failed them, right? And so, and that was a big being open and saying, well, actually, we have had these issues, a few purges here and there, like maybe a few deaths. They had to come clean about it because ultimately you couldn't move on. And that was a really big shock for a lot of people. And I kind of feel this is where we are now. And I mean, I have no evidence for this, but I think the Julian Assange release this week might be indicative of a new era of maybe there is a now recognition that we have to be a bit more open. We shouldn't be putting whistleblowers in jail. We shouldn't really, you know, it compromises our ability to look honest when he's in jail. So, you know, my prediction, and it's completely mental, I mean, it's just my deduction, is I kind of feel there are some truths that are going to be presented. Not, you know, we've done this before. Iran-Contra, I think, was the last time the system had to like contend with the like corruption. Here in the UK, corruption is now, everyone is admitting like the whole system is corrupt. I mean, we talked about this last week. It's really petty, ridiculous corruption, but there's also a lot more corruption. And the offshores and the game that offshores are playing in terms of hiding the wealth, and you know, whether or not we will get to see what really is, you know, in the offshore system. I don't know. I mean, you can't go around seizing assets and then also protecting your own shadowy undisclosed wealth.
I see what you mean, but there is a side that I think will never be able to be touched by Glasnost, which is arguably the one internal policy tool that still works, which is a strategy of tension that we also talk about quite often here. So this strategy of polarizing the extremes by infiltrating extremist movements with intelligence operatives or operatives who don't even know they're being manipulated by intelligence services, and getting them to commit acts that may be heinous or simply stupid to tarnish that side's reputation and essentially push people towards the center. There will be some things, I think, that we cannot be transparent about, and perhaps in many ways this could suggest that you're really ahead of the curve because we have not hit the full Glasnost point yet.
Well, no, I think this is why this summer is going to be key. I mean, the way I mean, hypothetical, it could go in many different directions. Like we're at an inflection point where I think Macron, let's do the French update. Macron calling an election early, and it coincides with July 4th, you know, the UK election. There's a huge scandal about July 4th because of the bets being put on by the Tories. But it's also interesting it's on Independence Day. Like that for me is kind of like, is that intentional? I don't know. So let's think about this in a very level-headed way. What could happen? Well, markets could react in a crazed way, and bonds will, you know, French bonds will start to sell off. At this point, you know, the euro will suffer, and you will see outflows of capital to the pound, to the dollar, to the Swiss franc, unless Le Pen, because by Monday, this is very important, and American listeners might not appreciate it. By Monday, France has a two-part election, but by Monday we will know if Macron's centrist party is still in the running. And if he's basically wiped out, as far as I understand, you're left with only two of the extremes. And so for markets, it could be Monday, July 1st, that we know like whether we're going to get a reasonable person or not in power. And if he's wiped out, the perception is that, you know, markets could go completely crazy. Now, let's just hold that idea for a second. Now, there is still a very good chance that the right or the left preempts any crisis. I mean, you've got to understand, like, people in France are talking about, like, you know, Macron's party saying, if you vote for these guys, the IMF will have to intervene. France will come under the supervision of Brussels. France is already in an excessive debt procedure, right? Deficit procedure, debt procedure. EDP, it's called EDP. And so it's already in trouble on its debt, right? So this is like, France is always saying crazy things, and it's not the first time they've been in this situation, but this time is a little bit different. And the important point is that there is scope for Le Pen and her, she's like behind the scenes, the main guy who's leading the party is called Jordan Bardella, and he's like in his 20s. He's like super young, right? How old is he?
28 or 29.
Yeah. So he's already talking back some of the spending plans. So, but at the same time, he's also giving hints that he's going to be a problem in Brussels. So there's this general perception that maybe, you know, if they do a Meloni, and by a Meloni, it's like she was supposed to be this radical disruptor, but then she's actually proved quite malleable, and you know, she's not turned out to be the crazed lunatic that everybody thought she would be, right? So if they do a Meloni, but they don't totally capitulate, but they basically are, they refuse to leave the EU. They're like, unlike the British, they're just like, we are going to take our nationalist interest and we're just going to be a thorn in your centrist technocratic, you know, bubble. And they form an alliance between Orban and, you know, Meloni and Le Pen and I guess whoever else has voted in right-wing governments, right? That might cool the prospect of a crisis. So we might still be okay. So I don't want to, like, I have to put that on the table, right? That is still an option. It just kicks the can down the road, but it's and then we wait for Draghi and we see how they fight it out for the scraps that he's going to present them with, right? But then the alternative is that they don't back down and markets flip out, in which case by the 2nd of July, 3rd July, we're going to be in a situation where the ECB either intervenes to buy French bonds to keep them in line. And today the market has started to, it's widening, the spreads are widening. So if the ECB intervenes, that might regulate things, but it also shows its hand, because at that point the ECB becomes totally politicized, because in theory it's not supposed to buy the bonds of any country that is an EDP. And so this will be a highly political move. As it happens, next week they're all at Sintra, which is an international gathering of central bankers in Portugal.
Central bankers.
Yeah. So Powell will be there. Bailey's not going because he doesn't want to upset like the UK election. But pretty much all the central bankers will be there from around the world. And I find that quite interesting in its own right, that they just happen to be all gathered at this integral moment where they have to decide whether to intervene and buy French bonds or not. Germany will kick off, of course. And I suspect if they don't, I think actually they might not on purpose to sort of show the electorate what might happen, so that by the second round, either Le Pen moderates, or at least one of the parties moderates, or Macron potentially puts in some sort of emergency rule. So those are the options on the table. But there's one other aspect of this, which is if the euro really starts to tank as a result of this craziness, I can see a pathway where there is a sort of emergency Plaza Accord. Do you know about Plaza Accord?
No. What is a Plaza Accord?
So it goes back to the last time they had massive exchange volatility, and they all agreed to basically regulate and soft peg to the dollar. So the central banks basically mutually supported each other to provide exchange rate stability. Of course, in the UK, I would see a harder peg potentially between the UK, between the pound and the euro, because obviously, as we've discussed with Draghi, if you see the prospect of France as a financial center collapsing, because remember, France was, after like the removal of Britain, somebody has to be the new financial center of Europe. France is best positioned because it's the strongest, like biggest banks, and it's a natural contender for it. But that gets smashed as a possibility. And so this feeds right into the hands of Brexiteers, but it also feeds right into the hands of Labour, because the Brexiteers go, haha, we told you so. City is alive. We're getting all the capital out of Europe. Labour gets to say, come, we've wooed the city. You can trust us. Take your capital to us, and we're now the reasonable party. But Labour also has, and this is the last bit of my like crazed speculative pathway. Labour also has the opportunity to save Europe, because it could put merging and going back to the EU on the table just in time for the election on July 4th, in which case it really does become a second referendum. I mean, would they do it? They've made noises about being friendlier with Europe. I wouldn't put it past them. Whether they do it in time for the election, it all depends on what happens in France, I think.
Well, I mean, I think those are really fascinating ways of seeing what could or will happen. And I really see your point on these central bankers and Sintra deciding for some kind of a trust-style shock to influence the elections as being, I would do that maybe if I were the central banker, if I had to control or some expectations management.
I think we have to also think like it's not like necessarily like a big plot. It is just the path of least resistance.
Yeah, it's people trying to survive at the end of the day, and institutions trying to survive. It's not. Yeah, no, this is not. It's not a conspiracy by any means. But there is one thing you said that really that struck a bit, because in particular, because when you were talking about how Maloney normalized, and we also have the example of Geert Wilders, right, who appointed this very samey prime minister or president, I forget, and how seeing how Bardella is walking back if they win, that will likely be again the path of least resistance, where they'll say, like you said, we won't leave the EU, we will try to change it in accordance with our vision and be a persistent thorn in their side. And it reminds me, as it should all of us, that at the end of the day, you said that would kick the can of this emergency down the road. And when you look at history, most of history, especially the Roman Empire, our good old favorite, it's just one big kicking the can down the road, right? From Augustus facing up to the economic challenges of his age and overthrowing the Republic, and that kept on going right up until the fall, if it ever fell. So what came to mind is, if we kick the can down the road, what would be sort of the explosive moment that would force a reckoning, if any?
Well, I think this is this rumor that like Draghi's delayed the public, like he might delay the publication of the report until September. So I think if we kick it down the road, I think we just put all the pressure on the report, and then they fight it out over influence over the new structure of Europe, and then it becomes like explicitly clear, what's at stake. And I think by that time, if it's about if it's about maintaining nationalist culture and fiscal and sovereign power within a bloc that has to get cohesive to be able to compete, I think that will be the explosive thing. I mean, basically, does Europe choose culture over survival? And does culture mean anything if you don't have the wealth to be able to support your culture. And this is the real issue. So I think it's all very well being, you know, nostalgic about your own specific traditions and whatever, but when you can't afford them, you suffer the risk of being like invaded by other countries. So because they will see it as an opportunity to manage our system better than we can, right? So that's what really makes us vulnerable. I don't think Putin is. What do you think? I'm very skeptical of Putin like wanting to extend into Europe, but I kind of see that if Europe can't get its shit together and people start facing the same sort of economic hardship that we saw post the collapse of Soviet Union, and I'm thinking here on my feet, I could see it as incredibly attractive for a external power to try and grab and take advantage of that weakness.
Well, certainly with if it puts Germany in a position of necessity, the easiest alliance that Germany always comes up with when it's in a position of necessity is Russia. And we saw that with in the Weimar periods and the Nazi periods, where Germany was dragged through. Well, Germany, the states in the area of Germany, because otherwise Germany doesn't really have that long of a history. But it always turns to Russia. There's a reason why in Dostoevsky's novels, everyone in Russia speaks German.
Yeah. I mean, these are all. I mean, I think this is for the next podcast, but and further down the line. But yeah, I suspect kicking the can down the road leads us eventually to some sort of system collapse, because I don't think you can have your cake and eat it. I think Europe's problem is that it needs to be under the wing of if it's going to maintain a fragmented like attitude, it will have to come under the wing of a stronger power,
or a stronger individual,
or maybe,
that
or
can somehow capture the imaginations of everyone.
I mean, it's the same argument against UK being alone, but UK becomes just like a predatory. I mean, its vision for a non-united European sort of global Britain is one where it's sort of it's the kind of intellectual leader of the world. That's how it sees. You know, we are the management. We are the management, right? Whereas the Americans had to, like, even though we lost our empire to them, they still had to maintain us because we know where all the bodies are buried and we know how to manage the system. Like when you have a conventional takeover of any company, you sometimes have to maintain the legacy team because only they know how it operates. That's Britain, right? And I feel like Britain will be like, you see, actually everything is better off when we manage it. But, you know, different story. AI is going to be key as well, because AI could be the determining factor of where power lies in the future. And this goes back to, I think, our closing point, which is who replaces Biden and Glasnost and blah blah blah. Why might it be happening now? Well, I think if AI is to play any part in the future, you know, it has to be maximum truth seeking, because if you filter it for the truth because the public can't handle the truth, which is that there are no easy costless ways to growth, then it won't be able to find the solutions, right? And I think that's why we have to have transparency. I think transparency is going to come, and whoever is prepared to go transparent first and have that moment of reflection and I guess an admission of failure in the past, is going to be the first to be able to restructure and move on, and maybe use AI to help guide where there is smarter allocation. So like Gosplan with the help of AI could be better than without the help of AI. Maybe it is better for us to put our trust in AI than it is in a bunch of crazy leaders However, if we are going to put our trust in AI, it has to be a truth-seeking AI. It cannot be one that is biased by anything. But if you do truth-seeking, you might not like what you get. You might not like some of the truths it comes up with. And therefore, you have to prep the population, and that means disclosing some of your greatest secrets. And, what is America's greatest secret? That is the question you have to consider. Like, what have they been protecting? I have a small idea about what it might be, but I definitely think...
I have a small idea too. It's very mysterious.
But who do you think they'll replace Biden? I mean, it's clear, like this morning, he was so thrown under the bus. It's beyond hilarious. So who replaces him?
I read this really good comment the other day. I think it was mentioned on Joe Rogan, which was that Gavin Newsom was what would happen if you put in all the looks and speech and mannerisms of stereotypical American president into a cloning vat, and he kind of grew it, And that really is what Gavin Newsom looks and acts like.
He reminds me of some sort of like baddie from like a action film, doesn't he? He's like so slick, and there's something so slimy.
He's a baddie that at the end of the day sits down with the main character. It's like, look, I was in it for the sex and the parties. I don't really know what I'm doing. And there's actually another bigger baddie guy on the side.
Yeah, I think he's kind of like there's something like icky, like sleazy about him. No, I don't know. Maybe it's just
like he slicks back his hair with grease every morning.
Yeah, I mean, like Trump. Let's face it, hair problems.
Oh yeah.
Don't throw stones at glass houses. But it is. I think one thing that is staring us in the face, and it's complete speculation, but if there is any truth to the idea that Trump has been obsessed with this story for a very long time, right? Actually, I'm reminded that all sorts of crazy things have come up in editorial meetings this week in terms of Trump's crazy. Remember, Trump is like, Adam Curtis once described it as like the chief conspiracy theorist, right? He is conspiracy theorist in chief. And he was the birth certificate guy. He was, but he's also been obsessed with JFK. From as soon as he came into office, he promised he would declassify the files. So my thinking is it's going to have something to do with that. I also suspect that the JFK files might be the ones that are in Mar-a-Lago. I wouldn't be surprised at all if those are the ones that are there. And I suspect, Biden has his equivalent of whatever he's got on Trump. And so there's going to be this like mutual like revelation. He'll just declassify that, and then Biden will show his, and we all realize everyone's a corrupt twat and we move on, and then we get a renewal, and the renewal candidate, because if it is true, then I suspect the obvious renewal candidate will be, regardless of what he said about vaccines or whatever, just the name Kennedy will be the renewal candidate. That's what I think will happen if we get disclosure of past.
So many things have to go wrong for the system for Kennedy to be put back in charge. But yeah.
Well, hypothetical? What would it do to the Democratic Party if I
think it would revitalize it.
No, but what would it do to the Democratic Party if it becomes confirmed that they or the CIA or anyone had anything to do with JFK?
I mean, I think the fundamental issue is how the JFK things kept on leaking into today, right? And then that bombs everyone, basically.
I don't know. This is all hugely
speculative. That goes to the strategy of tension, because that's what Kennedy was at the end of the day. He just got in the middle of that. So.
Well, do you have any ideas who Trump will pick as his VP?
No idea.
No.
Don't want to speculate. I can't. No. Because there was that QAnon theory about Kennedy as well, right? As Trump's VP pick, but
that was the crazy one. That was like
that was the crazy version.
That was the son of Kennedy who died in a
Yeah.
plane crash, right?
Yeah, and who didn't die in the plane crash, supposedly. And
So yeah. But this is, I think it's kind of funny that we have a Kennedy in the running, but it's just not. It's obviously not that one. But anyway, stuff to think about. What else are you writing about this week? We're going to finish now.
This week, what's going on in Kenya? It seems that the protests are aligned with a higher level of military cooperation between Kenya and the West, as well as the more basic story of the IMF conditionality from the loan that they took out in 2019, I think it was.
Right. That sounds really interesting. Well, I think we've got to go and write that stuff. So we've got to go. So I'm going to finish us here. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.